Well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Welcome to another Midrash Rabba 2.0 with myself, Rabbi Q, and this is my assistant, Renee.
Hi.
And we are going to be Midrashing Vayeshev today. So, for those of you who do not know what Vayeshev is about, it is the story of Joseph. Well, the beginning story of Joseph. And there is a lot to cover here, a lot. So, when we midrash, we want to seek. And I will propose to you that anytime that you seek something, it's because you don't know where it's at, right? You can't find it, you can't locate it. And so the premise is when we seek something out, it's because it's not in front of us. That requires us to move away from the area that we're at. So, what does that equate to in Midrash? Well, in Midrash, what we do is we actually speculate. We look at things that people would normally not look at, think about things that people would normally not think. In fact, the broader you can paint that stroke on the canvas of study, instead of it being so exegetical and it being so concrete, hermeneutical. You're like, what are those? Well, exegetical means that you objectively approach scripture and interpret it objectively instead of your own opinion. Well, it's a little bit different in Judaism. In Judaism, opinions matter. You see, in Christianity, they wanted to be so non-speculative that they made it concrete. And that is a mistake because there were 72 different paths of truth in Torah. And there are 32 or 33, depending on who you ask, paths of wisdom of Torah alone. Meaning we have so many different paths and so many different truths within those paths. It's almost impossible to force the Bible to be of any specific interpretation. How many of you today will read through the Bible in a year and just so happen to be reading a verse that day and find yourself experiencing in your current life experiences and circumstances what you're reading about that day? That is because of two things. Number one, the word of God is alive. The word of God is a person. That person is Yeshua. Yeshua is the truth. Remember, he said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. So, in principle, right, we want to look at it as if it has intelligence, right? Personal, practical love relationship is pursued. And therefore, if the word of God pursues you, then it will match up with your life during that time, during that day, during those moments. Okay. Now, when we get into the actual parasha and start looking at some of the things that are going on with Joseph, there is a tendency to just immediately adjust your brain to a certain state of belief. For example, many people, when they look at Joseph, think that he had pride because he had dreams and interpreted them. Many people look at Joseph and say that God humbled him because of his pride. Many people look at Joseph and say that Joseph's calamity was somehow merited, that he deserved it. I want to propose to you that that's actually anti Semitic. I'm going to propose to you that we actually have a problem with not only hindsight, but high horse judging characters in the Bible. Oh, if I was David, I would have never done that. Oh, really? And you know that for sure. You know that that's exactly what you would do. You know that under the circumstances that you would make those decisions. Let me tell you something. When I think about things like, for example, when the people are in the wilderness after they've left the Red Sea, after they've left the seven palms, after they've gone into the desert and don't have water, how do they react? And would I react that way? Well, let me tell you something. I've been on hikes out there in that desert and ran out of water, and been a long way from the car where there wasn't any water, but at least the car would get me to a place where there was water. Been a long way from water. And I could tell you, you get a little bit funny. You get a little bit worried. You start thinking about that you could actually possibly die. You start thinking about that you are in the middle of a canyon and there's nobody hiking this trail. You've chosen one of those trails to get away from everybody. Well, there you go. That was granted. Now you don't have any water, right? No cell phone service. It can get a little bit weird. It can get a little bit uncomfortable. So I guess what I'm trying to say is as we read this parasha today, as we study through this, what I want you to do is, instead of taking a subjective, opinionated, and I told you opinions matter, right? We're going to still go that direction, but the more what I'm trying to say is if you're going to go ahead and try to put yourself in the Bible character's shoes, then do it. Because I can tell you, you still believe. And here's the crazy part about this. I'm not talking to people who just now start watching this YouTube channel. I'm talking about people who've been faithful listening to it, who are part of the core group on Slack, or even my immediate family members. You still believe that you somehow merit something, that you have been a good person and therefore you deserve good things. And you can look at people who have bad things happen to them and you could decide that they did bad things. And you do it without any conscience. And you do it without any fear. And here's the irony. As you do that from this pedestal that you seat yourself on. But I can tell you right now that if true abundance was based upon your merit, I could clear out your bank account today of any blessing that you've received on your behavior alone. In other words, you're not a good person. You're just a person. And that is very important, because if we determine that everybody has the equal state of merit, which is none, then everybody has the same seat at the table. And if everybody has the same seat at the table, then prophets, writers of the Bible, psalmists, Proverbs writers, right? They're not any different than you. You see, I can take Joseph's story, superimpose it over my life, and say I would probably make worse decisions than him. And yet somehow he merited his time in prison. So we're going to go through and we're going to read this story. We're going to talk about it as we go. We may check some things, and you who are on Slack, if you feel that you want to speak up and talk about a moment in Joseph's life, then just unmute and interrupt and say, hey, let's study out this point, or let's start this. Let's talk about this Hebrew word. And we'll go from that point of view. Okay. So that being the case, we will go ahead and we will take a look. I will share my screen and we will take a look at this story that so many people have a tendency to judge. Sorry for the shaking. Yeah, that's all shaky there. Okay, here we go. And start the broadcast. All right. So it says, now Jacob lived in the land where his father had lived as a stranger in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when he was 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his other sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a multicolored tunic. And his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Then Joseph had a dream, and
Can I interrupt?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, first two things.
Okay.
In this one paragraph, we see Jacob being called both Jacob and Israel.
Nice.
And second thing, why is this bad report so important to whatever the story is?
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't say anything about what the bad report was about or what it led to. It just makes you, and we've said it on times past, sometimes the Torah purposely omits things to hopefully you'll dig a little deeper. And this is something I'm like, okay, it goes from bad report to a coat of many colors.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, let's take a break from that and let's chat about it. So let's start at the beginning. Okay. So, first of all, and I think this is important, is we know that two entities separately called Jacob Israel. The first entity was whoever Jacob wrestled, which we concluded could have potentially been Esau, who was a master of the dark arts and could have potentially seen the future, right? Especially because we know that Abraham was a prophet, and we know that Isaac was a prophet, and we know that Jacob is a prophet. And so it's very possible that Esau is a prophet. Now, what makes Esau a false prophet would be his idolatry, which we could potentially get into. But short version is in order to activate the magic that Nimrod was involved in, he would have had to have been involved in idolatry. That's the short answer. Now, there are a few things that are important here. The first one is, and this is extremely relevant, is that it's not just the person who he wrestles who calls him Yisrael, but instead later on in our last parasha, in chapter 36, it says in, or maybe it's chapter 35, it says in verse 9, then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram, and he blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. Okay, well, there's a lot that we could get into concerning that, but that was last week's parasha. But a couple things that I would like to point out, and this is important, is Paul said that none of this was written for their sakes. Okay, so Torah was not for those who were living Torah, right? So let me give you an example. Abraham has this entire life from age 0 all the way to 100 and what was it, 60 something? I can't remember. Anyways, and this is important. When Abraham lives that long, all of the things that happen in his life are not in Torah, right? But what is in Torah, Abraham still was just living. He was just applying his philosophies and he was just being himself. whether he was being a false version of himself because of his ego, or he was being a true version of himself because of his higher self, which is Yahweh within him. He was being himself. Okay. Now, what's really important here is that that was written for us, not for Abraham. Abraham lived his life according to his choices in his life. That became Torah, yes. But did he know that he was becoming Torah at that time? No, I don't believe so. And furthermore, Torah became that because of, and this is important, because of Abraham. In other words, had Abraham made a different choice and it come up as some dude named, I don't know, Josephus, we would have had Torah talking about Josephus. But Abraham's the one that made the choice. And Abraham's the one who decided to follow God, and God adjusted his plan according to that. Right. And so then now Torah as a person, as a intelligence, as a consciousness, actually develops a personal connection to Abraham. Understand? Okay. So the reason why this is important is because what's written is not everything that happens to Jacob or Abraham or Isaac, but only that which Torah wants in there. Remember, Torah,
which is a part of Yeshua.
Yeah. Torah, yes, that's good. Only that which is a part of Yeshua. True. Torah wants you to know things and leaves things out so you know other things. But I'm going to show you something interesting. The word here in the Hebrew is the word kara. Okay, let me see if I can say that a little bit better. Kara. Okay, kara is to call out publicly or to read out loud publicly. So no longer shall you be read as Jacob, but as Israel. What do you guys think about that? You feel free to unmute and interrupt me and say, what did you just say? What do you think about that? That it actually says, no longer shall you be read as Jacob, but you will be read, R-E-A-D, read as Israel. Genesis chapter 35, verse 9. That word is kara. And so what's interesting is that brings something up here, because this is actually something that comes up in Midrash almost every year, at least with my students that I've taught how to recognize these anomalies. Now, if I'm just studying with a regular group of Christians, I don't usually get this question. But the ones who I've said, hey, look, this is something you need to pay attention to. Torah omits on purpose. Torah admits on purpose. Okay. So why did Yeshua want him to be called Jacob in verse 1 and Israel in verse, let me check here real quick, 3. Let's take a look here. Okay. All right. So let's see. Let's talk about why would we read Torah and hear about this man and read it as Jacob? Let me ask you a question. Okay. All of you, even those of you who are in YouTube, if you want to post your answers, you can. How does an intelligence higher than your own view your past? What is it to a higher intelligence? What is past? What is your past to a higher intelligence? What do you think?
Well, I've
A
always,
time that is gone.
A time that is gone. Okay.
I always understood that your past was something that had to lead you to where you are now. It had to be part of your story enough to bring you into the season that you are currently in.
Okay. Okay. So I was looking at let's see, what was I looking at? I was looking at the Midrash questions to see if there was any questions about this week's parsha, and there isn't. But I still want to stick to our 90 minutes. So let's make sure that we structure that way so we can take our break when we need to take our break. If you read about, say, and I will admit I'm a little bit biased, so you're going to hear about, you'll hear me bring him up a lot, but if you're going to read about Abraham Lincoln, in what capacity do you reflect upon the life of Abraham Lincoln? And does it have any bearings on your life decisions at all? What I mean by that is that when we think about historical figures or we think about the past, we have a tendency to reference it in the sense of history. It's just history. It doesn't really affect your day-to-day life. You don't go to the bank and say, well, Abraham Lincoln saved, so am I. You may look at some of his philosophies and develop some models about how you would like to live, but it is still your choice. Whereas if we were to look at your past with you involved in the looking, you would think very differently, wouldn't you? You see, when he says no longer, I want you to think about what that means in the divine. The divine sees Jacob in all of his aspects. He sees Jacob as the nation of Israel. He sees Jacob as the one being born who grabs the heel of his brother. He sees Jacob steal the birthright. He sees Jacob, well, buy the birthright, technically. He sees Jacob receive the blessing. He sees Jacob in Abraham's prophecy when he promises Abraham that all the nations shall be blessed through you, right? He sees it all, and yet he says, no longer shall you be read. No longer shall you be observed. No longer shall it be cried out in public that you are Jacob, but instead that you are Israel. Is the land today that certain tribal peoples are occupying in the Middle East called Jacob? Are they called the sons of Jacob? Speak to the sons of Jacob. Doesn't, right? He says, speak to the sons of Israel. So we need to understand the difference. Now, we could go relatively, I don't know, here goes that kind of that judgmental bias and potentially even anti-Semitic, because of course, wasn't it? It was one of the dictators of the Axis powers, and I can't remember which one, who said, just like Jacob, they marry our women and they take our money, but they do not support our land. They do not support our nation. And as a result, basically concluded that just like Jacob, they were manipulating, lying thieves, meaning what? It is very easy to jump on the anti-Semitic bandwagon by referring to him as Jacob. But here's the intrigue. What really was Jacob before he was Israel? It's an easy one, actually. This is a simple answer. What was he? The just and the unjust.
Right.
He was nobody. But when he's Israel, according to Yahweh's determination that he's Israel, he's in covenant. And why did Jacob receive a name? There's a pattern in the Bible. And that pattern is that when you enter into covenant, your name changes. And that is a very important pattern because truth be told is that when we enter into covenant and our name changes, we then have to no longer be Jacob, but Israel. But here's the crazy part. Those who interpret our life, even in the past, should no longer be judging our life by that past name. Meaning we read Torah, and the only reason we look at Torah and see Jacob is to learn how to enter into covenant. Jacob's lesson, remember, it was written for us and not for them. That's what Paul says. And so what's important is that when we read it as Jacob, we're learning how to what? Approach covenant. We're learning how to understand how to navigate the ego. But when we read it as Israel, if we start at the beginning and we say that Israel grabbed Esau's foot, what is happening? The soul of Yaakov, the soul of Israel, is already embracing his purpose by grabbing the heel of his brother and taking hold of the inheritance, just as Isaac did instead of Ishmael. And furthermore, Israel reaching out and wrestling, and in the womb wrestling, Israel wrestling, always wrestling, always fighting men and God, right? So now you can understand why sometimes it says Israel and sometimes it says Jacob. But what's interesting is when we start to do that, when we allow Torah to name him in those moments, is how we need to look at it. Because here's something crazy. If you read that verse 1, now Jacob lived in the land where his father had lived as a stranger in the land of Canaan. What does that tell us? It tells us that he was not activating covenant, or he was not acknowledging covenant, right? He was operating within the flesh of his ego. How do we know? Oh, we're about to find out, aren't we? Right? Because what's going to happen with Levi and Simeon, right? Okay, so now we look and we say, okay, when he says Israel in verse 3, when Torah says Israel in verse 3, loved Joseph more than all of his sons. It doesn't say other sons, it just says his sons. So don't get sucked into that mess. There's a reason why those italics are there. They're to help you understand it better in English, but in the Hebrew, it is not read that way. You see, what people don't understand is the concept of love in the Hebrew lifestyle. Okay. There is a difference between an abstract concept and a concrete concept. And love in Hebrew is concrete. You have to see it, you have to touch it, you have to hear it. And that means that there has to be an action of love. And when you study out the Hebrew word love, which we will today, you will find that we actually are going to experience action, not abstract concepts. Okay? So, but what I want you to see is it says Israel loved Joseph more than all of his sons because he was the son of his old age. Now, in the Hebrew, this reads just a little bit different, but let's see if I can navigate it. I'll share the screen with you and we'll take a look at this. We'll study this for a moment. Okay. Okay, here we go. All right, so we've got now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because the son of his old age he was. Okay, let's take a look in the Hebrew here. So it says Israel, it doesn't say now Israel, it says and Israel, he loved Joseph. So this Aleph Tav right here is actually the definite direct object marker, meaning Joseph is the definite direct object of Jacob's love, okay, as a verb. And then it says from all his sons. Now, there's a few things we could get into with that, but let's just leave it alone for now. For or because, and that's really not how this word works. You need to think of this more along the lines of just a conjunction that basically kind of just connects the one from the other, not necessarily an and, but then it says ben zakanim. So it's interesting because when we get into the word zakain, right here, zakain, it's to become old, right? Or to be old, right? Okay. But now going over to this zaken is old age or extreme old age. Okay. So this is the son of his old age. Now there's a number of different ways we could interpret that, but the short version is that it's actually it's worded actually as the son of, this is in a construct form. See right there, construct, which means we put the word of with it. Son of his ages, or the son of his oldest, as it were, okay? Or his oldnesses. Now, there's a number of ways we could look at this, but I want you to notice that this is actually from a verb, to be old, right? But the premise is that it is only used 4 times, okay? And This one is used a little bit more. It's used 27 times. And I want you to know that they're kind of sort of using this Arabic information right here to explain the concept of being old, right? In the sense of a she camel that lets her lip hang down, okay? In other words, they're not don't have as much strength. Okay, so this can be about strength. Okay, so the reason this is important is because when we are working with this word, we have to be careful that this isn't necessarily about years of life. Okay, it's not about years of life. In fact, let's go take a look at it in the ancient pictographic Hebrew. Ancient pictographic Hebrew. We'll just paste the Strong's Concordance number in there. And then got to remove this H because Strong's Concordance number uses H or G and numbering. Old school Strong's doesn't do that. It uses a different numbering system, but new school Strong's does something different. Okay, so here we go. We're going to jump over to this. And then we are going to take a look at this word zakane, which is an adopted root. Okay, an adopted root, but interestingly enough, is an adopted root of a parent root. And that parent root is actually, interestingly enough, going to be Kaf Nun, where we get the word priest, right? Kohen, etc. So here's the interesting thing. It actually, the concrete is a root, okay? Quite simply a root. And the action is to stand, right? And the abstract is to be sure. Okay. The pictograph Kaf is a picture of the open palm, and the Nun is a picture of a seed. Combine these mean opening of a seed. When the seed opens, the roots begin to form the base of the plant. By going down into the soil, the plant rises out of the ground, forming the stalk of the plant. A tall tree can stand tall and firm because of the strong root system which supports it. Okay, now watch this. The first word in the Hebrew that's recognizable is going to be Kohen, right here, Kohen, which is what? Kohen is priest, right? In fact, Kohenah is the priesthood or administration. But the way that I want you to think about this is that it has to do with standing firm. Okay. In fact, the word ken itself means yes in Hebrew. Right there. That means yes in Hebrew. That which stands firm, or an affirmation or an affirmative particle. Right. Okay. So now, how do we get from that to a Kaf Nun right here? That's what we call a cognate. So let's talk about cognates for a second. Okay. Cognates are basically words that sound like other words. So example, in Hebrew, we have the kaf, which is spelled C-A-P-H, kaf, as having two sounds to it. It has a hard K, k, and it has a soft K, ch. Okay. The kof, Q-O-P-H, is pronounced with a hard K all the time. K. Whereas the kaf is k or ch, depending on whether or not it receives that treatment, and that has to do with where it's located in the word and what syllable it's in, which I know can get really confusing, especially when you have suffixes, infixes, and prefixes, right? It can get kind of confusing, and it can get hard to know when to say p and ch. But what's interesting is what is related between the two is actually has to do with the steadfastness or the upstandingness of a priest, and interestingly enough, their beard. In other words, zaken has something to do with beard. And I know you saw in that ancient Hebrew lexicon, the Bible, that actually one of the root or one of the concrete words in there was root, but also beard. And that's because in the electronic version, Jeff Benner has put into his lexicon the stems in the concrete. Okay. So basically, a word starts out as a root, and then all these other words stem off of it. But the actual true concrete, kaf noon, has to do with the opening of a sprout, and it's digging down roots in order to become a strong stock, right? To grow up strong and thick in order to stand steadfast against what? The wind, the weather, etc. That is the illustration that the Hebrews chose to describe a priest. And the length of his beard is actually that. Okay. Now, it is important when we are referencing this that we remember how abstract from the rootstock we have gotten with the word zaken. But understand also that zakenim or zakenim, plural, is more than one beard, which means what? More than one wisdom. And so now we know that Joseph was the son of his many wisdoms or his many priesthoods. Okay. Now that could get really interesting because we know that Jacob, of all the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jacob was the only one to activate covenant. And he was the only one to decide to set up what? The house of God, Beth El. He was the first one to make a location into a temple with an understanding of what he knew about temple, because remember, he studied under Shem and became a master of mysticism. His brother became a master of the dark arts. He became a master of mysticism. And when we did the Rabbi's Nugget last week, I showed you that it was a showdown of good and evil, right? It was a showdown between light and darkness, and all the opportunities that Jacob gave Esau to show the light, to bear the light, right? Trying to get his brother to tikkun, trying to get his brother to become a Baal HaTeshuvah, to become a master of repentance, overcoming his ego. And so the reason this is important is because when we are working with a model of Christian interpretation, we're going to miss all of this. We're going to miss the concept that the reason why Israel loved Joseph was not because he didn't like his other sons. Jacob was not somehow caught up in the material or in the vanity of a, eye candy trophy wife, as Christianity would have you to believe, that Rachel was more beautiful and therefore he loved her more. But instead, that Joseph somehow was a son of his wisdoms. And I propose to you that the reason for that has to do with DNA and maybe goes back to mom's reference to the ladder that Jacob saw as being the DNA or his generations. But check this out. Epigenetically speaking, Jacob did not have the wisdom of Shem's yeshiva, experiencing the blessing from Isaac, being warned about not going to Haran, but going to Shem first and then going to Haran. The experience of wrestling, the experience of Esau's manipulation, the experience, all these experiences, and all of a sudden, we understand that Joseph actually holds the wisdom of some of those things, right? So when it says the son of his old age, because here's what I want you to think about. When was Joseph born? During his time in Haran. Mm-hmm. So how is Joseph the son of his old age? And why were the other sons supposedly younger? See, that doesn't jive, does it? And see, that's the mistake that people make. People say, oh, well, Joseph was born later on. No, if you watch, Rachel conceived before they left Haran. So why was Joseph loved more? It had nothing to do with Rachel. Joseph had within him the information about the wisdoms. Maybe his other sons didn't. I don't know. Maybe his other sons didn't have the gift. I don't know. But what I do know is that Joseph was different from his brothers. And we know that. We know that Judah was not the one chosen to go to Egypt and save the world, etc. Right? Somebody else was chosen to go to Egypt. And that somebody was not chosen on some sort of weird merit. This is what I want you to think about. What was Joseph's purpose in Egypt? Hindsight being 2020. I mean, come on, guys. If we're in the middle of those 13 years, you're not going to fool anybody with your thoughts. You can pretend like you would do better than Joseph, but truth be told is you probably would do worse. I dare some of you to try to just survive what Joseph survived. But the point being is that as we connect with that, we are basically connecting with the context of suffering without a reason to suffer. And yet, a huge purpose, a huge plan. No other mind was going to be able to do what Joseph was going to be able to do in that moment. No other mind had the wisdom to govern an entire kingdom like Joseph did. Okay, so now what we need to do then is understand that when it says Israel loved Joseph, why is he called Israel in that moment? He's called Israel in that moment because Joseph is an example of covenant. Mm-hmm. Yahweh tells Jacob that his descendants would be basically the blessing upon the earth. I think about things like, let me see here. Okay. I think about things like what happened with Levi and Simeon, right? And I think about things like what happened with Reuben, right? Where we are basically experiencing a we're basically experiencing a dereliction, right? What appears to be a dereliction. And I don't remember who actually like provoked the other sons to sell Joseph, but I do know that when we're working with this model, that Joseph definitely demonstrated a different spirit than the rest of the sons.
Mhm.
So Joseph demonstrates covenant evidence, right? Especially when we get into the Zakanim. What is a Zakanim? Well, when we know that it's consequently just basically means the beard, okay? We know that that word Zakain has to do with a beard. And so there's that principle. Okay. So now getting into that concept, now we understand that when we read the name Israel, we're understanding that it has something to do with covenant. And when we read the name Jacob, it has something to do with Jacob not at that moment operating within covenant. How many would agree with that? Does anybody disagree with that?
I've had the understanding, I guess, for a couple of years that when it talks about Jacob, it's talking about a lower self.
Mm-hmm.
And when it talks about Israel, it's talking about a higher self.
Mm-hmm.
And even a higher purpose. Not that he's necessarily living in that higher purpose, but that it is a higher purpose. But yeah, so I would definitely agree with that, when we're looking at Israel, we're looking at covenant and a covenant lifestyle and understanding. And why are we saying that? I mean, they're why would covenant be that Israel would love Jacob or Joseph more? Why would that be covenant? Because literally Messiah. Even the Jews know, even the unbelieving Jews know that Messiah was either going to come as Ben Joseph or
so there are some rabbis who do believe that, but not all of them.
Okay.
In fact, there are, for example, Rashi didn't believe that. He believed that the Messiah didn't come because of senseless violence, but he disagreed with there being more than one Messiah.
No, that's not really what I meant. I know that not all the sects believe that, and I do, but there was a certain sect. I met a Jewish man who was talking about the coming of the Messiah, as in soon, and he was like, the only question is it going to be Ben Joseph or Ben David? So that the understanding was he was going to be like Joseph or he was going to be like David.
And they
not that they believed in the two comings, but they believed that there was that
he might be one or the other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay, so now you understand that if we're talking about Jacob, we're probably talking about a lower self, and when we're talking about Israel, we're talking about a higher self. So what's interesting is the lower self lives in the land. Now, it's interesting. There's a number of different ways we could say live, but in this case, the word live is Vayeshev. which really kind of means to lay down, or sit down, or settle down, as it were, right?
Similar to Abraham's father.
Mm-hmm.
In the fact that, not fully walking in what he was supposed to walk in.
Sit, remain, dwell. The Ethiopic let me see if I have a Latin translation here. I don't. Secund cohabiter, facere, basically to marry or consummate a marriage. And so we could possibly go in the direction that he took concubines. Okay. Very possible. And then also potentially that, just like Deb said, he did not remain nomadic. Okay. But I think it's important that we understand that that is not the Israel who loved Joseph. The Jacob living in the land was not the Israel who loved Joseph. In other words, in a weird sort of way, Joseph helped Jacob hold the vision. And I think possibly, I'm trying to think of when do we encounter the story of Shechem in this.
It's coming up. It's pretty much right away, right?
Right. And so what I'm wondering is if he should not have stayed in Shechem, right?
Well, the purpose was to go to Shechem to find his brothers. Right? And Israel, it's verse 13. Israel asked Joseph, aren't your brothers pasturing the sheep in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Genesis 35:4, which is right before 35:9, actually says, so they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which they had, and rings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was near Shechem. And then it says, then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem, right? Yeah. So, I keep leaning in the direction that some of what we're encountering here is Jacob just feeling utterly defeated because he went to dwell in Shechem. Simeon and Levi pulled their stuff. Now he has a reputation and he can't dwell in the land as Israel. He has to dwell in the land as Jacob. Perhaps fear. I don't know. We have to really be careful that we don't step into a state of judging him as if it's something that we ourselves wouldn't do.
Right.
And I think that's important. I think that's very, very important. Okay.
I also think that trying to understand why he would have done certain things helps us to understand why we do certain things, right? And helps us to sometimes even overcome those habits, and if we don't want to walk in the same way.
So we have something interesting happen that we probably need to chat about. And that is that we have Reuben having I will give you the actual reference here because I don't want there to be any confusion about this. So if we go back, I believe it is in chapter 34, which is going to be last week's parasha, but um um yeah, 35:22. I'm gonna read to you what this says in the Hebrew because I want you to catch this, okay? And it came about while Israel was living in that land, okay? That Reuben went and slept with his father's concubine Bilhah, and Israel heard about it. Now there were 12 sons of Jacob. There's a lot going on in that verse. That has the name Jacob and Israel in it. And we didn't cover that last week because we had one heck of a rabbi's nugget that needed to be addressed, right? Okay. So
It's funny that Bilhah is named as a concubine there, but she's named as a wife here in verse 2.
Okay. So you caught that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk a minute about that. Okay. When Rachel does not conceive, she gives Jacob Bilhah, right? I think it's Bilhah. And says, perhaps I will have children through this woman. There's a lot of ways that we could look at this, and I'm not going to just dump the idea that this may have been a cultural thing that we don't understand. But if we approach it from the fact that they were just as human as we are, it looks like maybe Rachel thought that she would be able to adopt the children and that this woman was a surrogate or a person to carry the child, and then the child would be Rachel's, but that ended up not being the case. Evidently, Bilhah kept this child. But there's no reference really to her being a concubine. In fact, I believe it's in verse 30 or chapter 33. No, sorry. Further back than that. It's in chapter 30. Yeah, she says, then she said, it says in verse, so this is chapter 30, verse 3. She said, here is my female slave Bilhah, have relations with her that she may give birth on my knees, so that by her I too may obtain a child. I don't want to explain to you the Middle Eastern cultural adoption ritual concerning knees, but I can tell you that it exists, right? But then it says in verse 4, so she gave him her slave Bilhah as wife, and Jacob had relations with her. Let's see if it is that word bride there, or yeah, so it's just Isha. So the English is interpreting it as wife, right? But then when we go over to chapter 33, 5 or 34 rather, in verse 22. I'm sorry, chapter 35, verse 22, we have something different going on. And when we look at this, what we've got is the word being used as Pelegesh, a Pelegesh. And Pelegesh is used 37 times, and every single last time without fail, it is translated as concubine. So what is the difference between a concubine and a wife, right? So a wife has the covenantal protection of adultery. What does that mean? That means that if a man desires your wife and seduces her, or they have any type of relations, that she is guilty of adultery. But if it's a concubine, she does not have that protection. Basically, the way that you could think about this is a live-in girlfriend. Okay. So why does Torah call Bilhah a Pelegesh in verse 22, 35, 22? Why is Bilhah called a Pelegesh instead of an Isha? She never had wife status. She never had wife protections. It just says that she was given to Jacob as a woman, as his woman. Okay. Now, in chapter 37, we see Bilhah being named a wife. But let's see what it says in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it says, Isha. And very specifically, so his father's women, right? It doesn't say wife. Okay. Now somebody say, well, wait a minute now. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, it says, therefore, this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they two shall become one flesh. And that word wife is Isha. Okay. But then we have something very interesting happen. And that is the Torah commandment concerning the spilling of seed. It says that if a man goes into his woman, that they shall become unclean until evening. But interestingly enough, if you read that the way they're interpreting this word Isha in these other verses, then it is unclean for you to consummate your marriage, enjoy the wife of your youth, etc., etc. So, difficult word, right? Difficult word to interpret, because truth be told is the only way that you would really be unclean per se is if you were with a woman who you were not in covenant with, which would be a concubine, right? Because how is Yahweh going to command a man and a woman to be joined and become one flesh and then turn around and call them unclean? Thoughts? Anybody want to share their thoughts on that one? There's a reason that this is important and relevant. There's a reason why we need to have this discussion, and that is because these children are actually, at least the sons of Bilhah, are Rachel's adopted children. There's another place where they're called concubines, by the way. You guys know where that's at? Genesis chapter 32. What happens in Genesis chapter 32? He separates them out, right?
Mhm.
And when he does, what he does is it says, now he got up that night and took his 2 wives and his 2 female slaves and his 11 children and crossed the shallow place of the Jabbok. And when we look into the Hebrew, it says, he got his 2 wives and his maids, but it is the shifcha. A shifcha, 63 times in King James, is handmaid or maid servant, a very different kind of servant than a male servant, right? The handmaids or bond maids were potentially concubines. Okay. In fact, I will show you this. I'm just go ahead and share my screen real quick so you can see that I'm not just talking outside of my neck here. Right there. A synonym with an amma. What's an amma? A concubine. Okay. So the way that I want you to understand this is that a female servant was potentially a concubine. In fact, here it is mentioned again, right? Right there. So I want you to understand this is different from a slave. This is not a slave. Okay, this is a very inappropriate translation here of calling this a slave or a slave girl. Okay, this needs to be understood correctly. All right, there we go. So what is this telling us? Because this is important. Did Jacob send Joseph with the sons of Leah? Did Jacob send Joseph with his adopted brothers? Yes. And it's interesting because it says that he brought back a bad report, but people assume that that Joseph was given the responsibility over his brothers. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that Jacob was sent to monitor his brothers. It just says he brought back a bad report. Do you have any idea what that could be? What a bad report could be? It doesn't necessarily have to be some bad thing. It could have been a bad report in terms of sales, right? It could be in a bad report, but it says about them, right? So I want you to understand, he was with his brothers, right? While he was a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his fathers, and brought back Joseph a report about them. There's no about them. Okay. So let's take a look at it here. So the word is diva, okay, in the sense of motion or whispering or a defamation. It's from the word devav, which means to move gently, glide over, right? Okay. But the principle here is that it's only used 9 times in King James. But every one of them has something to do with defaming or slander or infamy. So why don't we take a look at, let me go ahead and share my screen here real quick, and let's take a look at the other verses in the Bible that use this word. If it's only used 9 times in the entirety of the King James Old Testament, we should probably pay attention to this word. These are the records of generations. Jacob, we're reading that one right now. Next one is Numbers 13:32. They brought back a bad report from what? From the land they had spied out. Numbers 14:36. As for the men, right? As for the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land, who returned, they led the congregation. They had a bad report, right? 14:37, bad report. Okay, that's already 3 of our 9 verses. Counting our verse, that's actually 4 of our 9 verses. All of a sudden, we jump over to Psalm 31:13. For I have heard the slander of many. Terror is on every side. While they took counsel together against me, they schemed to take away my life. So now we're starting to get into this concept of slander, right? Proverbs 10:18. One who conceals hatred has lying lips, and one who spreads slander is a fool. Proverbs 25:10. Or who hears it will put you to shame, and the evil report about you will not pass away, right? And then Jeremiah 20:10. For I have heard the whispering of many, terror on every side. Denounce him, denounce him. All my friends watching for my fall say, perhaps he will be persuaded, so that we may prevail against him and take our revenge upon him. And then Ezekiel 36:3. Therefore prophesy and say, this is what the Lord says, for good reason they have made you desolate and harassed you from every side, that you would become a possession of the rest of the nations. You have been taken up in the talk or rumor of the people. Okay, so what's the point here? When he brings back this information, it's slanderous. Every other verse is false information. So all this time we thought he was being a tattletale. What was he doing? We will openly allow Joseph to be human. We're not trying to make him a saint. We're just not trying to judge him as if we could do better. That's what we're trying to make sure of. I'm not going to throw Joseph in the pit because he slanders somebody. Right? Because when he finally walks in his purpose, tell you what, right? Okay. So where do we want to go with this? We now have an ability to study Torah to understand how to defeat the ego. We have an ability to study Torah to understand how to activate the higher self. And we find it contained within these verses about Israel. Verse 3 contains the name Israel. Verse 1 contains the name Jacob. Understand. Learn from that. Understand what it means for you. Right? Okay. So we have about 8 minutes left. Anybody like to comment on what we have learned so far, what we've talked about so far? Anybody want to explain their insights? feel free to unmute and let us know. Okay, well, I'm going to assume that you would have been able to find the unmute button because I know sometimes it's buried, right? And let's go ahead and kind of wrap this part up. From now on, when we see Israel, we understand its instructions for the higher self, instructions for the light, and we understand that when we see the name Jacob, that we probably need to understand that it has something to do with the death of the ego. What was Jacob's fear? Why was he dwelling where he was dwelling? Why did he have to send his brother to go find his sons in Shechem? And what's the difference between verse 3 and verse 12? Those are questions we'll answer when we come back. We'll go ahead and start our break now. We'll be back in about 30 minutes and we'll start part 2 of our broadcast. For those of you who are not going to be back, Shabbat Shalom. For those of you who are staying, we'll be back in about 30 minutes.